Welcome back to another episode of Second Career Pilot. Today, we're tackling a cornerstone of professional flying. Attitude instrument flying, especially how it works with the modern electronic flight displays you'll find in most advanced aircraft these days.
That's right. It's a fundamental skill.
Absolutely. If you've already spent some time in the cockpit, you understand that when the ground and horizon disappear, well, your instruments become everything. We've gathered some great resources that really zero in on these modern EFD systems and, the skills you actually need to master them.
And they've really changed the game compared to the old steam gauges.
They really have.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to get beyond just describing attitude instrument flying with EFDs. We want to unpack the core concepts, talk about the instruments themselves, their roles in control, and introduce you to the essential techniques, all while keeping in mind that perspective of someone maybe transitioning into a professional pilot role.
Yes, someone may be coming from older aircraft or even just starting their instrument training.
Exactly. Okay, so let's maybe start by looking at that shift, that evolution in the cockpit.
Yeah.
The move from those classic analog gauges to the integrated digital world of electronic flight displays.
Yeah, it's quite a transformation. For a long time, a pilot flying IFR relied on, well, a whole collection of individual analog instruments, right?
Yeah.
The six-pack. Now, EFDs are pretty much standard in new general aviation aircraft. They put all that critical flight information onto clear LCD screens. The main one right in front of the pilot, that's the primary flight display, or PFD.
And right next to it, often you've got the multifunction display, the MFD,
Right.
which is incredibly versatile. It shows navigation maps, engine data, checklists.
All sorts of things. And what's really smart is how many systems allow that MFD to basically function as a backup PFD if the primary one has an issue.
That redundancy is key.
Definitely.
But it's not just about looking modern, is it? This shift has real safety implications.
Oh, absolutely. The solid-state tech behind EFDs, no moving parts in the same way, means they have much lower failure rates compared to the older mechanical instruments. That's a genuine increase in safety. It really shows how far the technology's come.
Still, you can't rely only on the main electrical system, right? There are backups.
You got it. Redundancy is still crucial. So, aircraft with EFDs always have backup instruments. They're often non-electrical or have their own separate battery power, just in case of a total electrical failure. Things like a standby attitude indicator, maybe an airspeed indicator, an altimeter that work independently. Essential stuff.
Okay, so we've got this high-tech environment. Let's talk about the core principles of attitude instrument flying itself. What's the fundamental idea?
Well, at its heart, it's controlling the aircraft's position in space, its attitude, using only the instruments, not looking outside.
Yeah.
Think about VFR flying. You use the natural horizon, right? For Pooch and Bank. In instrument flying, the artificial horizon line on your attitude indicator. That becomes your horizon. That's your main reference.
So for someone making that career transition, it's a big mental shift. You have to fundamentally change your reliance from outside cues to what the instruments are showing you.
Exactly. And understanding precisely how each instrument works and what it tells you about the aircraft's attitude is just critical.
Yeah.
Not just for, passing the check ride, but for actual safety if you accidentally fly into IMC, instrument meteorological conditions.
Right. Now, the sources mention two main learning methods: control and performance, and primary and supporting. But they also say both use the same instruments and controls. So what's the actual difference? Is it just emphasis?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, emphasis. The control and performance method really focuses on setting a specific attitude and power setting first, using your control instruments. Primarily the attitude indicator for attitude and power instruments like the TACH or manifold pressure gauge for power. Then you monitor the performance instruments, airspeed, altimeter, VSI, to see if you're actually getting the result you wanted.
Okay, let's break down those categories. Control instruments, what falls under that?
Control instruments give you that immediate feedback on your inputs. Like we said, the attitude indicator is number one for showing pitch and bank changes right away. And then your power instruments, manifold pressure, tachometer, maybe fuel flow, depending on the setup they show. Direct changes in engine output as you move the throttle. The key thing is they show small changes immediately, allowing for really precise control.
And performance instruments, how do they differ?
Performance instruments show the result of those control inputs. They tell you what the aircraft is actually doing. So, airspeed indicator, altimeter, vertical speed indicator, VSI, heading indicator, slip skid indicator. Those are your main performance instruments. They lag slightly compared to control instruments because they show achieved performance changes in speed, altitude, heading, or rate of climb descent.
Gotcha. And sometimes power indicators can be performance too.
It depends a bit on how you think about it, but
Hmm.
sometimes they're viewed as performance because they show the achieved power, not just the throttle position. It varies.
Okay, and the last category, navigation instruments.
Right? These are all about knowing where you are and where you're going when you can't see outside. So your GPS displays, VOR indicators, NDB indicators if you still use them, moving maps definitely. Also things for approaches, like the localizer and glide slope indicators for an ILS. They give you that lateral and vertical guidance.
All right, so imagine you're in the soup, instrument conditions, relying on all this. How do you actually make a change? Say, initiate a climb or a turn. The sources talk about a four-step process.
That's right. This is fundamental. Establish, trim, cross-check, adjust. That's the mantra. First, you establish. You set the target pitch and or bank using the attitude indicator and adjust power using the power instruments. Knowing the approximate pitch and power settings for standard maneuvers beforehand really helps here. Gives you a good starting point.
Then comes trim. Why is trim so critical in IFR flight? Seems even more important than in VFR.
Oh, it's huge for workload management. If the aircraft isn't trimmed properly, you're constantly applying pressure just to hold attitude. Trimming eliminates that constant pressure, freeing up your mental energy to scan the instruments, think ahead, make decisions. When you're flying IMC, your workload is already high. Good trim is non-negotiable, really. It lets you detect subtle changes much easier, too.
Makes sense. Step 3 is cross-check. What's involved there?
Once you've established and trimmed, you have to systematically cross-check. You scan across your relevant control and performance instruments to verify the aircraft is doing what you want it to do. You're interpreting the indications, seeing if there are any deviations, how big they are. It's an active process.
And finally, adjust.
Right. Based on that cross-check, you make small, precise adjustments using your control instruments, again, attitude indicator, power controls. The key word is small. Over-controlling is probably the most common error when learning instrument flying. Think finesse, not force.
Okay, let's connect this process back to the modern EFDs. How does it look on a glass panel, starting with pitch control?
Well, with an EFD, the attitude indicator is usually much larger, dominating the PFD. The resolution is so good you can see tiny pitch changes. You've got pitch scale markings, often in 5-degree increments, but you can easily make finer adjustments. And many use that yellow chevron symbol instead of the old miniature airplane, which gives a really precise reference point for pitch.
And banking. How do you manage that on the PFD?
For bank, you use the roll pointer, usually at the top of the attitude display against the roll scale or index. That index has markings for standard bank angles, 0, 10, 20, 30 degrees, often 45 and 62. Helps you visualize. Plus, you have the turn rate indicator, often just below the attitude display, showing you your rate of turn, usually aiming for that standard rate, 3 degrees per second.
And power control with EFDs. Is it different?
The principle is the same. Set power using your engine instruments, which might be digital readouts now, and cross-check the performance on airspeed and VSI tapes. Smoothness and precision are still key. One potential trap with digital readouts, though, is chasing the exact number. Trying to get exactly 2,400 RPM instead of focusing on the performance, the airspeed or climb rate you actually want. It's about the result, not just the number.
Good point. Now, what about that other method, the primary and supporting instruments? Can you walk us through an example, maybe for just holding straight and level flight?
Sure. So in this method, for each element, pitch, bank, power, yaw, you pick one instrument as primary for that specific task. It gives the most direct info. Others are supporting. For maintaining a constant altitude and straight and level flight, your primary instrument for pitch control is actually the altimeter. It directly shows if you're maintaining altitude. Supporting instruments would be your VSI, showing the rate of climb or descent, the altitude trend tape on the PFD, and also your airspeed indicator, because pitch changes affect airspeed.
Ah, okay. So the altimeter is primary for maintaining altitude. What about a rule of thumb for corrections?
Yeah, a common one for small altitude busts is to make a vertical speed correction that's about double the deviation. So if you're 50 feet low, initiate maybe a 100 foot per minute climb, but usually cap it at around 500 FPM for small corrections to avoid chasing.
Okay. And for holding a heading, maintaining bank.
For bank control in straight and level, the heading indicator is primary. It shows your magnetic heading directly. Supporting instruments would be the turn rate trend indicator, if you have one, and the magnetic compass. But the compass lags and has errors, so the heading indicator is your main guy once it's set correctly.
And keeping the ball-centered coordinated flight.
For yaw, the slipskid indicator of the ball is primary. It's the only instrument that directly tells you if your rudder and aileron inputs are coordinated. Keep the ball centered.
Finally, power setting in straight and level.
In that specific case, Maintaining a constant airspeed in level flight, the airspeed indicator becomes your primary instrument for power. Your goal is steady airspeed, and that's what directly tells you if your power setting is correct for level flight at that speed.
Right, it all connects. So beyond understanding the instruments and methods, there are fundamental skills. Cross-checking or scanning is huge.
Absolutely massive. A disciplined, effective instrument scan is non-negotiable. It's this continuous, systematic look at all the key instruments. Your scan pattern needs to adapt to the phase of flight, but you're always gathering info from both control and performance instruments. And with PFDs, the scan has adapted a bit.
How so? The sources mention a radial scan. What's that like?
Yeah, the radial scan is very common with PFDs. The idea is you keep your eyes centered on the attitude indicator maybe 80–90% of the time. That's your hub. Then your eyes make short, quick movements out to the other key instruments, like spokes on a wheel, radially. You glance out to the airspeed tape, back to center, out to the altimeter tape, back to center, down to the heading, back to center, up to the slip skid, back to center. Because everything's so close together on a PFD, these eye movements are really small and efficient. It helps avoid fixation.
And you need to include engine gauges too, right? Even if they're on the MFD.
Definitely. Your scan needs to incorporate engine instruments periodically, wherever they're displayed, and also take in situational awareness elements like the inset map on the PFD if you have one.
Now, one feature on EFDs that seems really helpful are those trend indicators. Can you explain those?
Yeah, trend indicators are great. Those little colored lines or vectors you see extending from your current reading on the airspeed tape, altitude tape, and sometimes the turn rate indicator. Essentially, they predict where that value will be in a very short time, maybe 6 seconds or so, if the current rate of change continues.
So they help you anticipate.
Exactly. They help you see subtle deviations starting before they become large, allowing for smoother, more proactive corrections. The turn rate trend, for example, shows where your heading will be shortly, making rolling out precisely on a heading much easier. They're also super useful for leveling off smoothly at an altitude or capturing a target airspeed. You can use the vertical speed trend to judge when to start your level off.
But you shouldn't fly just the trend indicators, right?
No, absolutely not. They're a supplement, a predictive tool. You still need to base your primary control inputs on the actual current readings of your main control and performance instruments that just help you refine those inputs.
Okay. Lastly, let's touch on common errors. What are the big pitfalls pilots fall into with instrument flying?
Well, the classics are still relevant, even with glass cockpits. First is fixation. Staring at one instrument, maybe getting mesmerized by the airspeed tape or a trend vector, and ignoring everything else.
Yeah, I can see how that could happen.
Second is omission. Just completely failing to include certain key instruments in your regular scan, maybe forgetting to check the standby instruments periodically, or ignoring the slip skid indicator. And the third one is emphasis. Placing too much weight or importance on a single instrument's reading, letting it dominate your decision-making when you really need the whole picture from your scan.
So it all comes back to that disciplined scan and interpretation.
Precisely. Understanding the systems is one thing, but mastering the skills of scanning, interpreting, and controlling smoothly is what makes a proficient instrument pilot.
Understanding and mastering attitude instrument flying with these modern EFDs is really a cornerstone of safe and proficient piloting, especially if you're considering flying in more diverse conditions or making that leap to a second career in aviation.
The precision and the sheer amount of information these systems give you is fantastic. But like you said, those fundamental skills, interpretation, discipline, cross-check, they're just as crucial as ever, maybe even more so because there's so much information to manage.
It really makes you think about how all these integrated displays work together to give you that complete picture of what the aircraft is doing moment by moment. So maybe a final thought for our listeners. What stands out to you as the single most critical aspect, or perhaps the biggest challenge, when making that transition from primarily visual flying to relying on instruments with an EFD? Something to ponder. Thanks for listening.